amazing book, very powerful, and I recommend to everybody. He's a social and political historian of the United States of America, and he has written some fascinating stuff, including a book about Bob Dylan called Bob Dylan in America, which I recommend highly to all of you young Democracy Summer Fellows who maybe don't understand your parents' fascination with Bob Dylan, but Sean Wilentz will make it all very clear for you. Thank you for joining us, Professor Wilentz. And then we also have Sidney Blumenthal, my friend who has been just a recurrent and indispensable figure in contemporary American politics. And he's had a remarkable career, first as a journalist for the Washington Post and Vanity Fair and New Yorker and a lot of prominent magazines, but then also as a political actor. He was, I believe your title was speechwriter for Bill Clinton, and was a close advisor of President Bill Clinton, and then also of Hillary Clinton's, playing a similar kind of role. And you can find all kinds of right-wing conspiracy theories about Sid Blumenthal online if you decide to search around. But he's been reborn, not just as a political critic and analyst and eminent degrees, but also as an historian. And he has written truly dazzling multi-volume series about Abraham Lincoln, which I love. He knows I hang on every word of this series, and I will call him frequently to remind me where I can find this or that, or how to refute some dumb Republican appropriation of a Lincoln phrase or a misquote or something like that. But anyway, you got to check out the series. It's called, I think it's called A Political Life, but it's a political biography of Lincoln. Lincoln as a politician, and what were the decisions he made, and at what point did he make radical moves to state things, and at what points did he hang back and wait for things to develop. A Self-Made Man is the first one, Wrestling with His Angel, and the most recent one is the remarkable book called All the Powers of the Earth. So these are our two guests. I invited them to come on to talk about this issue. What is the American right? We titled it Power, Privilege, Paranoia, and there was one other P. I can't remember what the other one was. But anyway, what is the American right? How does it work? Where does it come from? How should young people think about this extraordinary antagonist of strong democracy in America? And where did it come from? And you couldn't find two better people to discuss it. And with that, I'm going to start by kicking over to Sid Blumenthal to talk about the times we're in today, and then we'll hit rewind with Professor Wilentz.
Well, great. Thank you, Jamie. It's a real privilege to be here. Glad to be on your webinar. When I first came to Washington in the mid-'80s, at the beginning of Reagan's second term to work on the national staff of the Washington Post, there were actually very few people outside of the Reagan circle and the conservative movement who understood that how powerful the right wing was. I wrote a 4-part series on the right wing for the Washington Post, and it was an eye-opener for people. People had no idea of the extent of the institutional power, the money, the organizational strength of the right wing, and its relation to power, and how they really extended their influence all the way up to Reagan himself, President Reagan. Flash forward, it's now 1998, and and we're on the eve of the impeachment of President Clinton. President Clinton had been under siege since the Democrats lost control of the Congress in 1994. He was elected in 92. In 94, Newt Gingrich comes to power. And Newt Gingrich really pioneers a lot of the techniques that Donald Trump has taken up. I mean, Ted Yoho is really the low rent version of Newt Gingrich. I mean, he's just he's just sort of coughing and sneezing versions of Gingrich. But Gingrich was outmaneuvered by Bill Clinton, even though they were supposedly the new revolution and the Republican Revolution, and the right wing had taken over Clinton, through his political acumen and cunning, had outmaneuvered him, and they had gotten reelected. They had shut down the government twice, tried to get Clinton to agree to their program to cut Medicare and Medicaid. They were totally frustrated. And the impeachment was really the byproduct of their frustration, their political frustration. I can recall speaking with Hillary as she was about to go on the Today Show, and we were discussing this, what it seems like to some people an abstract matter. And even then in Washington, people didn't understand there was a right wing. And we were talking about it and how they had created this impeachment scam, which is what it was. Hillary went on and used the phrase vast right-wing conspiracy. That seemed to capture a lot of the conception of what we were dealing with. It was not, a joke, as some people in Washington thought. And those who have thought it now recognize the threat to the very republic we're in from Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, while he is a unique, singular sociopath, also represents the far right wing and their ideas in American politics, and has brought them to extreme fruition and to a constitutional, political, social, and moral crisis, and a racial crisis. All of that has its origins in the radicalization of the Republican Party that begins with the right wing rising and taking it over and morphing over time.
Yeah, and it goes back, it's all of a piece, as Sid is saying. I mean, Gingrich came to power in 1994, but he came to power because he had managed to led a charge to topple the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, in 1989, an extraordinary thing to do on non-charges, on completely made-up charges. So in fact,
not quite, but
yeah, well, all right, but I mean,
venial sins,
flimsy charges as far as
flimsy. He had sold his own book to the Teamsters.
Yeah, okay. This is not a huge crime compared to what the Republicans were doing, but never mind. So, by the time that Gingrich comes to power in '94, he's already made his bones. He's already, pioneered this technique of using ethics violations of one kind or another, enlisting liberals actually in his cause, and going after big names. And by the time we got to 1994, President Clinton's name was very much on the docket, very much on the list. He was the next one they were going to go after, because actually, as your colleague, Jamie, and my dear friend John Lewis pointed out to me in 1998, when I was involved in the impeachment struggle with Sid, this wasn't, all these charges were hokum. This has been plotted for a very long time. This was a style of politics that succeeded Ronald Reagan. It was, as Sid said, a radicalization of the right wing in a different direction. And that's what we've seen since '94. But its roots go back even before that, certainly to the Reagan Revolution, and even before, right, Sid?
Yeah, well, Reagan himself is the realization of a long struggle inside the Republican Party by conservatives that goes all the way back to Herbert Hoover's loss of the White House to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in reaction against the New Deal. So, when we're really dealing in this near centuries-long struggle now, as people talk about, a President Biden who might institute a New Deal. Well, these forces are still arrayed in American politics. And what happened inside the Republican Party is, over time, after Hoover's loss, was the development of a right wing in reaction to the New Deal that tried to take over the Republican Party, was frustrated time and again in gaining control of the presidential nomination, became more and more bitter, and felt itself to be a dismissed minority in the party, led by Senator Robert Taft, and they really wrecked themselves. It was thought when Dwight Eisenhower won the Republican nomination in 1952, and in a way, that whole period of the 50s was, and the early Kennedy period, was the gestation period of the Goldwater movement and the takeover by the right wing. In reaction to the civil rights revolution, we're now mourning John Lewis. What John Lewis did, and what Martin Luther King did, and what all those, freedom riders did, and what Lyndon Johnson did when he became president in, advocating and signing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, was to reawaken this right wing on a racial basis in the South, and remember the George Wallace movement for president. George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, who stood in the schoolhouse door, said segregation, now segregation, forever. All of that was then assimilated into the Republican Party, and consciously as a political movement to try and defang Wallace, but also to win those constituencies through racial resentment. Code words then, not code words under Trump. And this is we can talk for hours and hours. It's a very long development, long history. And Reagan is a key, crucial figure in it. And let me just say one thing more about Reagan. As they say, it was not an accident of history that he began his 1980 campaign in Neshoba, Mississippi, at the Neshoba County Fair, near the site where 4 civil rights workers had been murdered. And the place was festooned with Confederate flags, and he spoke in defense of states' rights. And he knew exactly what he was doing and what he was appealing to.
Can I jump? I want to bring it back a little bit to the 30s and 40s, though, and get to a point that Jamie was raising earlier on, which is that neither the Republican Party nor the right wing has been monolithic. There have always been streams within it. If you go back in your history books and you see who ran against FDR after Landon, then you get, Wendell Willkie, Tom Dewey. This was the liberal wing, internationalist wing of the Republican Party that was in the ascendancy for a long time, which helps explain the frustration that Sid was talking to. That all through the 40s into the 1950s, there is this hard right wing that erupts with Joe McCarthy for a while, which is an interesting moment, but that is continually being rebuffed within its own party, if you see what I'm saying. So that when Dwight Eisenhower comes in, it's not for nothing, for example, that the head of the John Birch Society, Robert Welch, the sort of hard line of this right-wing movement, accuses President Dwight Eisenhower of being a conscious agent of the communist movement. Now, this is an intramural struggle within the Republican Party, within conservatism. And, whereas Eisenhower was willing to accept the basic reforms of the New Deal, these people were not. They never were, they never would be. It's with the Goldwater movement, and it actually begins as early as 1960 when Goldwater was actually put forward as a possible nominee. He didn't get it. Nevertheless, he turned to conservatives and said, all right, we're going to take this party over, and they did in 1964 in no uncertain terms. So what you're seeing is the victory of one part of the Republican Party vanquishing another part of the Republican. Mm-hmm. And in 1964, once the civil rights things kick in, as Sid was talking about, then you have a very new Republican Party, which is going to lead to Reagan.
Well, how far back does this go, Sean? Or maybe I would make the question more definitional. What is the right? I always liked Oscar Wilde's statement where he said, I'm on the left, which is the side of the heart, as opposed to the right, which is the side of the liver. Is it something that is kind of irreducible and just at a level of emotional and moral psychology? Or are there real class interests and race interests and political interests that are being represented by the right? How should young people, Democracy Summer, we got 150 high school and college kids who are getting engaged in a very deep way in politics. How should they think about what the right is, how to recognize it, how to confront it, and how to beat it?
You can't understand the history of the right wing in America at all without understanding the Confederacy. The Confederacy was the great conservative movement in American history. Much intellectually, if you want to call it that, ideologically, politically, etc., that we think of as American conservatism comes out of the Confederacy or the things that led into the Confederacy. In many ways, the founding father of American conservatism is one of the founding fathers is certainly John C. Calhoun, whose monuments are now being removed. But I mean, I think it's in the
Who was the great champion of slavery and the apologist for slavery.
Yeah.
The great champion of slavery, and the man who invented state rights in its current formulation. You know, if there was an intellectual father of the Confederacy, it was John C. Calhoun. Now, you know, in some ways, what I'm saying really is that the Civil War has never ended, and that the issues that were fought over between 1861 and 1865 were not settled. We thought we could settle them with Reconstruction, but you know, the Reconstruction was overthrown by the forces that had been, you know, most vociferous, by you know, ex-Confederate officers and their followers. They overthrew Reconstruction, and that was going to lead to the, you know, rebirth of a certain kind of Southern racist conservatism, which was at the heart of American conservatism and remains at the heart of American conservatism, as you're seeing fought out even today in these battle over the monuments. Yet again, we're having to deal with that legacy. Now, that's not the answer to your question, Jamie, but it's an essential element.
So think about this. Think about this, what Sean raises about the Confederacy. Just think about this one line from, and today people are taking down Confederate monuments. That's a very contemporary thing. And those monuments were put up as a reaction against Reconstruction and the suppression of all the rights that had been gained as the results of the Civil War by the Union, and the triumph of the South in a process that was called redemption, which was the imposition of something as close to slavery as could be done. And it was the Jim Crow system. And so that's what we're living with now. But think about this. The leader in South Carolina of the anti-Reconstruction forces through a white terrorist militia was a man named Ben Tillman. And he became Pitchfork Ben Tillman. He became the governor, became the senator. He was a leader of virulent racism. His closest advisor was the father of Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond became the senator and governor and senator from South Carolina and the founder of the Dixiecrat Party, breaking in 1948, running a separate party against Harry Truman and the Democratic Party because Truman backed civil rights. Mm-hmm. And that's another line of the origins of the right wing in America that we're still dealing with today.
Right, and he was originally a Democrat, right? Thurman was a Democrat who later became a Republican. And that move,
South, yeah, exactly, Jamie. The Solid South was all Democratic. And what's happened is that it's in the process of it becoming Republican is the major story of the rise of conservatism as a political power in the United States through a process of realignment. And that process is something now that we're turning around. And that's what we're living through and what they're fighting. And that's why it is such a hard-fought, difficult, and bitter battle right now.
Well, and I also want the fellows to focus on the point you just made about the third-party run or running as an independent, because that move was done by a number of racist Democrats. George Wallace did it, Harry Byrd did it, Strom Thurmond did it. Whenever the Democratic Party began to make any move slightly to the left, they would basically say, we're going to take 30 or 40 electoral college votes out of your coalition and show exactly that the Democratic Party depends on the Dixiecrats. And the realignment you're talking about really begins with Johnson saying, we're going to do the Voting Rights Act to 65. We're going to lose the monolithic white vote in the South. And that became the Goldwater-Nixon strategy of turning the South into the Republicans' base and making the Republican Party the racist party, making Lincoln's party, your guy's party, the racist party. And that's where we are today, right?
Yes, but there's also this alliance. There's a new coalition, and the coalition is based in the South, and it's not for nothing that so many of the politicians, Republican politicians, that were the bane of us in the 90s, people like Trent Lott or Newt Gingrich and others, all came from the South. That was the heart, in many ways, of the Republican Party. Nevertheless, there was the alliance of the reactionary elements in the North, and the business elements, the Liberty Lobby and so forth. This is in effect where Reagan comes in. I mean, Reagan's from California, which is the state that's neither, it's the American state that's neither North nor South, right? But Reagan had learned his political lesson, having started off on the political left, had learned his political lessons, working for General Electric and imbibing this right-wing reactionary anti-labor stuff that had come out of the 30s. What Reagan managed to do, he was the beneficiary of it in some ways, but he was able to marry that realignment in the South that you guys were just talking about with this reactionary anti-New Deal politics that had come out of the 30s and 40s. That marriage is the modern Republican Party, historically and spiritually. And that's what we have to see that's going on, is that it's not a monolith, but it continues reforming itself. And that's what we're dealing with. And it ultimately culminates in Donald Trump.
Okay, let me ask you one more question, then we'll open it up to the fellows. Do you believe that today's Republican Party under Donald Trump, which resembles a religious cult as much as a political party, but do you think it is fundamentally transformed and now has more in common with extreme right-wing fascist parties around the world? Or do you think it is still the same old Republican Party, just energized with this special authoritarian energy today?
My view is that this is a different party, and the idea of drawing in these elements of the South, and particularly the religious right and evangelicals in the South, and using certain issues to get them in, was going to be an add-on to the Republican Party. The Republicans thought they could maintain their party, just add this on, you get a marginal vote, and that way you can have power. That's what Nixon thought. And that all got transformed over time.
The exception swallowed the rule there.
Yeah, I mean, they got swallowed by the whole thing and changed by it, and became a different sort of organism. There is much, over time, the Dixiecrat Party. Under Trump, Trump has purged what, the final, elements left of, traditional republicanism, and turned it into something not completely different, but, very hard right in his moment in this, post-Cold War world, has aligned it with authoritarian forces, and his model reflects those in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Russia, and elsewhere. And this is the American version of that. How exceptional.
Another way to look at this, President Kennedy had a famous line where he said that those who seek to ride on the back of the tiger end up inside. That's what happened to the Republican Party. For a long time, they thought, the establishment thought that they could ride this populist, very violent populist movement and ride it to victory, coming out of the South, coming out of the religious right. Well, what happened was that they kept, telling these people they were going to be their candidates, and then they would always ultimately disappoint them. They got angrier and angrier and angrier. They didn't like politicians anymore. That's where Trump comes in. By the time you got to 2016, after 2 terms of Barack Obama, an African-American president, that base was furious. And they were back just any old right-wing Republican. They were going to back a man who not only spoke to their ego, but who spoke to their id. Who wasn't just going to sound like a racist, who wasn't just going to sound like a misogynist, or even sound like an anti-Semite, as many of his ads did. He was going to be a racist. He was going to be a misogynist. That is how the Republican Party has changed. What Trump did was to take the end point of this radicalization and to commandeer it for himself in his own image. And that's where the authoritarian stuff comes in, I think, because then it becomes more than just a Republican Party anymore. it becomes dangerous, very dangerous.
I just want to add one thing, which is I want to get Sean to just discuss the recent book that he edited for the Library of America of the writings of Richard Hofstadter, who was the great historian of the paranoid style in American politics.
Yes, exactly right.
And Trump has sort of distilled it down to its hard essence and stripped it of any veneer, even of code words. And
That's right.
maybe, Sean, you could just discuss, just for a moment, the paranoid style
Yes.
and Hofstadter.
Richard Hofstadter was a great historian who was alarmed, very alarmed by the Goldwater movement in '64, wrote a series of essays about it, but at the time was very interested in the irrational aspects of American life in general, but especially of American politics. And he'd been writing in particular about anti-intellectualism, hatred not just of intellectuals, but of the whole idea of rational discourse and how that had been a part of American politics going all the way back to the very beginnings, to the nation's founding practically. And what he defined in this wonderful essay, which I just published, we just republished it. You can find it online with the Library of America. 2 books, but especially an essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And what the paranoid style was, feeding in from everything from evangelical excesses to democracy itself in some ways, because democracy has a suspicion of experts and suspicion of people in charge, that it came up with, at its extreme, became a kind of syndrome of American politics. Conspiracies, everything devolved from conspiracies, a kind of hatred of anyone on the outside, outsiders. This was a style that he defines very, very well. And I think that if you want to understand Donald Trump, yes, you should go back and read The Paranoid Style in American Politics. I mean, Richard Hofstadter unfortunately died very young. I'm just glad he didn't live to see his own style, his own book, what he had described, come true with such fruition under Donald J. Trump.
All right, well, look, why don't we turn it over to the fellows? And as we do, I just want to underscore the last round of points that these guys made by talking about my own congressional district, which was represented 2 members ago by a very liberal, moderate, lovely Republican, Connie Morella, who used to win in Maryland's 8th with like 65, 70% of the vote, the kind of margins which, knock on wood, we will continue to get for the Democrats. But because the Republican Party completely abandoned and deserted those kinds of people, we had moderate Republicans as U.S. senators from Maryland, Charles Mathias, Mac Mathias, and it just would not happen today. I mean, you could say Hogan is kind of in that mode, who's our vaguely moderate Republican governor, but as he's decided that he wants to try to run for president the next time around, he's moved steadily to the right, especially on all these questions of voter suppression and democracy in elections that the Democracy Summer Fellows are working on in this election cycle in 2020. All right, the floor is open. Maddie, if you want to call on some fellows.
Sure. We had a lot of questions submitted this time, so we'll try to fit in as many as we can. But first up, we have Joe Ridley Thaler.
Hi, I'm Jojo. I'm a rising senior at Boston Lawn High School in Boston, and I'm wondering how we can fight right-wing ideology without in turn feeding sorry, without in turn feeding into the hyperpartisanship that is plaguing the country.
Excellent question.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for that question. Well, you know, reason itself is under siege, and that's one thing that is being diminished here. Even science is being turned into an ideological question. Look at the isolation of Dr. Fauci. The contempt for scientists across the board on climate change, environmental law, even, agriculture. And the scientific experts in the federal government are being driven out. And in a way, this is kind of the reductio ad absurdum, but the logical conclusion of the Republican hatred of so-called big government. It's against expertise. And a lot of it is, what the conservatives and, and what Trump really appeals to is like, owning the libtards, and who are they? Well, they're it turns out they really hate people who may have some genuine expertise and knowledge, who work in responsible positions. And it strikes me that this is beyond hyperpartisanship. This is simple nihilism that is trying to destroy the very basis of America.
Sean, I want to, Sean, bring you in. Sean, I want to come to you, but let me add to Jojo's question just by saying, because I experience this on a daily basis. We'll come into the Judiciary Committee to talk about a real problem like immigration or voting rights or whatever it might be. And then the right-wing Republicans start talking about Peter Strzok and his girlfriend and the deep state conspiracy theory and so on. And so what are our choices? Either you just kind of ignore it while they're putting out all this propaganda and disinformation, or you begin to answer it and you get in back and forth. And then it looks like you too have now just entered the field of hyperpartisanship, and it's just all political, and you've got your truth and you've got your truth. And so how do you find that solid ground Sid is talking about of reason and science and empiricism?
Well, I think one of the first things to understand, though, and I think this goes to popular understanding of the whole idea, Jojo, and it's a great question, of what hyperpartisanship is. The idea out there is that both parties are hyperpartisan, which is just not true. It's not symmetrical. There is one party that is a genuine, normal American political party that has everyone in it from, AOC to Joe Manchin. That's a party. That's a real party that has, various tendencies in it. The Republican Party has ceased to be that for a very long time. It's not just cultish under Trump. And this is not anything new. A very excellent book by Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann, written some years ago, made the point very clearly that it's worse than it looks for all the reasons that the congressman just pointed out. But it's worse than it looks because the Republican Party has ceased to be a normal political party. It has become an ideological cult. It is Bolshevik in its tactics. That goes back to Gingrich. Truth be damned, we're going to go after it. Power is everything. We don't care much about the public good, even if it means destroying our enemies. Latch to this paranoid style that I was just talking about, the conspiracy style, all that stuff that you're facing with in the Judiciary Committee with these crazy, crazy conspiracy theories that they're cooking up in order to disgrace us. Being an historian rather than a politician, I can't give you the formula for how you deal with that. But I think one thing to do is not to fall into the trap, right, of accepting politics on their terms. And insofar as this coronavirus, the pandemic crisis has shown anything, this is the fruit of conspiratorial politics, right? This is the fruit. We're now having to live through the effects of everything you've had to fight against you, but it's killing people. It's killing people by the hundreds of thousands.
Because they started off with saying that Corona was a hoax, the COVID-19 was a hoax and Democratic plot and all that.
And look at Dr. Fauci. As Sid said, now now we've arrived. Now we've got the fruits of all of that madness, and it's killing people. And it's a racial storm unlike any we've seen in one time quite glorious, then an extraordinary outpouring of anti-racist sentiment that we've never seen in world history. Extraordinary. But at the same time, strife that is very, very difficult for us. All of that legacy of the Civil War, it's all happening at the same time under this president. And it's happening because of what the Republican Party has become and what it's done. And I think if we point that out, and I think it's getting pointed out more and more in this campaign, and I think actually Joe Biden's going to do a very good job of that, pointing out simply in his calm way, this is what you've got from these people. At long last, can we give this up? I think that that's a very strong point for us, but it has to begin with the idea that hyperpartisanship has not been a bipartisan thing. It's been much more in one party than in the other.
Thank you. Maddie, let's go to the next one. Thanks, Jojo.
Sure. Our next question is from Isra.
Hi, I'm Issa Kadri. I am a rising junior at Wheaton High School in Rockville. So my question is, given that conservative ideology generally places great importance on limiting federal power, specifically for the president, and a stricter interpretation to and adherence to the Constitution and Bill of Rights, how come there is such a strong Republican support for practices that are clearly abuses of power and unconstitutional? And is the basis of the Republican Party now more about supporting Trump and his administration?
Awesome question. Who wants to go?
I'll take it. You know, the parts of the Republican Party prided themselves on being advocates of limited government and small government, to the extent that, as Grover Norquist, a conservative tax advocate, claimed, he wanted to drown government in a bathtub. And now what you've got are essentially little green men, like like Putin sends out, militarized militias from the federal government at war with the American people, truly in violation of constitutional principles that there should be no federal police domestically. And there are lots of doctrines about that legally. And how do they square that circle? Hypocrisy is the answer, because they only want a certain partisan result. And they expose themselves through their own actions on this one. And it may be that this is what Trump has left, is a kind of militarized response attempting to discourage people from voting, voter suppression, and to create disruption around the voting process as we go forward. I think it's an extremely dangerous moment. And what you point out correctly is this punctures the fallacy that they always upheld, their ideology of limited government.
Well, and Sean, let me ask you, was federalism always a pretext for the right, or was there some honest to goodness, sincere belief in states' rights and limited federal government, all that stuff?
Because I want to say, Israel, your name, you've got your school's name is named after a great American. I just wanted to point that out to everybody. It's a great name, Ida B. Wells. But look, states' rights, limited government has always been a slogan. It's not just a slogan. It's not a true belief. I mean, the slaveholders, for example, were all for states' rights when it had to do with keeping the federal government from, interfering with slavery and the slave trade. They were all for it, but they weren't for states' rights when northern states started passing laws against the fugitive slave law, when they started, asserting states' rights against that law to protect slaves from being recaptured by their masters. So states' rights is, whose ox is being gored. It's not about that. The reason it became such a big deal was that the federal government has always been the major force in American history, against slavery when he got to the 1850s and the election of Lincoln, but B, for civil rights. So states' rights is a way to say we don't want civil rights. It's not about the rights of states. It's a way to kill the rights of African Americans. That's what it's about. But look, when it comes to sending federal troops to Portland, or where it comes to abortion rights, and we can interfere with women's bodies however we want, they're not for states' rights. They're for letting the federal government do what they want you to do. So So I find it not just hypocritical. I just think that it's a slogan rather than a principle.
And states don't have rights anyway. States have powers. People have rights. Rights belong to people. All right, Maddie, let's go to the next one. Thanks for that great question.
All right, our next question is from Tasneem.
Hello, my name is Tasneem Aleem. I'm a rising high school senior, and my question is for Mr. Blumenthal. Do you ever help politicians with policy changes that largely contrast their previous stances? And do you think citizens should give considerable focus to these past stances or accept new growth and change?
Did you have something specific in mind, Tasneem? Did you have a specific example in mind, or?
No specific example, but I saw on Mr. Blumenthal's bio, like, you know, who he worked with in the past. And so I was curious if that came up.
Cool. Well, and let me sharpen it a little bit, Sid. I know Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which made it impossible for gay people to get married. And now, 20 years later, like, marriage equality is the law of the land under the Obergefell decision. And it's kind of the glue of the Democratic Party today, in a way. The gay civil rights, the LGBTQ agenda is something that unifies everybody. So how do you think about changes in people's political positions over time, whether it's the Clintons or Lincoln or what have you?
Well, I worked in the Clinton White House in the second term. You know, some of the positions that were taken then are not positions that are the positions of, you know, Democrats today, like marriage equality. And the politics of the time have changed. And as the circumstances have changed, more is possible. On this question of gay rights, both the Clintons had gay friends, and they were very close to the leaders of the gay movement and the movement about AIDS, and they were put in a very bad spot early in the administration by conservatives in the Congress and elsewhere for other reasons in the bureaucracy, in order to undermine him early in his administration on a position they thought was politically unpopular, namely gay rights then. It's changed a lot.
But let me ask you, Sidney, but without violating any personal confidence, I mean, do you think that Bill and Hillary Clinton during that period were really opposed to marriage equality and opposed to gay people serving in the military, or were they just bending with the winds, or they went as far as they could go? And how do you compare that to Lincoln? I mean, one of the things I take from your Lincoln books is that Lincoln always believed that slavery was wrong. In his heart of hearts, he always believed it was wrong. But at certain points in his career, he just talked about union and the importance of union. And he didn't really fully unveil an anti-slavery conviction until, well, I don't know, 1862, they abolished the slavery traffic in DC, or the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 63. I mean, so how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, a lot of these questions are, are questions of the art of the possible in politics. And it's often hard, if you haven't lived through the events, to imagine what it was like to deal with them. So, Lincoln was subjected to intense criticism from people like Frederick Douglass early on, because he didn't immediately announce an Emancipation Proclamation. And he had strategic imperatives and difficulties in holding the Union together in a, violent civil war before he could do that. It was not that he wasn't anti-slavery, and he had to come over time to that position. It took a long time to do this.
But to take the longer view, though, there's always a connection, look, between people in power, the politicians, if you want to call them that, and people who are social movements, people outside power. There's always a connection that's going on there. And the possible is made possible by both ends in different ways.
That's right.
I mean, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was very famous for saying that people came up to him and said, we want this, we want a Social Security Act, we wanted this. And he'd say to them, well, go make me do it. Go make it possible. There's a division of labor in American politics between these social and the politicians who can actually, the lawmakers who can actually bring things into fruition, who can actually make them possible. The best example being civil rights under Johnson, or even gay rights, recently. Barack Obama was not for, gays to marriage until very late. That required pressure from the outside. It required a change in public opinion. That's what can happen in the outside. And a student of democracy should never lose sight of that. At the same time, you have to never lose sight of the fact that there is this division of labor, and without the people like you, Jamie, to actually get it done, it's never going to get done. So in terms of people being consistent, times change, politics change. What was impossible at one point becomes possible at another, but that's in part because of things that are going on outside of collective politics.
Well, and what the young people have to think about is what they want their own role to be, because and at different points, I mean, look at John Lewis. I mean, John Lewis was arrested 40 times. He literally was the first person in the line on the Pettus Bridge facing the German shepherds and the billy clubs and the racist sheriffs. And I think he never got over the experience of being part of SNCC. I think for him, that's what real politics was. But then later in his life comes to decide to go to run for Congress and to try to push the parliamentary political system to the left as much as he could. But you play different roles at different points. And but anyway, this is why I love Sid's book on Lincoln, because you can see someone who had extremely passionate moral convictions, but also he was committed very early on to a life in law and electoral politics, and the decisions that he made, and at what points he took courageous action, and at other points he felt it wasn't ripe yet, it wasn't ready. And those are the kinds of decisions that people do have to make when you go into public office. Great. Why don't we go to the next one, Maddie?
All right, we've got Rochelle here.
Hi, my name's Rochelle Berman, and I'm a rising junior at the Charles Jewish Day School. So my question is, how does white supremacy fit into the current state of right-wing America, and what can we do to combat this group of white supremacists before the situation escalates further?
Well, I mean, I think we were saying earlier, I mean, white racism has been at the core of American conservatism for a very, very long time. So it morphs, it changes its character, but I mean, it's very much there. One can't deny that. Now, one of the things that's happened, and these are moments that are very extraordinary in American politics. It happened in 1965 at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it happened in Minneapolis with the killing in police custody of George Floyd. There are these moments where, and part of it has to do with being actually shown, visualized, but there are these cracks in time where I think white people, particularly of goodwill, who may not have been as aware of what was going on, suddenly are made aware. And these are extraordinary moments. They don't happen often. And the point is, I think, to make the most of them when you can. In 1965, during this after Selma, Lyndon Johnson, within 2 weeks, had addressed a joint session of Congress with a very famous speech, and then proceeded to get the Voting Rights Act passed very, very quickly. That's not going to happen in the wake of George Floyd unless we can have a change in administration. But there are these moments where you can break through what has hitherto been, Procrustean American habits, things we hate. They can be undone. And I think we may be at one of those moments right now.
Yeah, we're living in real history, real time now. And this reaction to the murder of George Floyd is one of the great social movements in American history. It is a larger biracial, multiracial movement than existed during the civil rights movement. There were many whites who were made possible the civil rights movement, but it was not as widespread as this is at all to deal with it. And if there's a new administration that takes up in policy terms, dealing with the underlying issues, then this movement will have had immense influence and not simply be an outside protest movement. It will be seen as in the way that what John Lewis did at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which led to the Voting Rights Act signed by Lyndon Johnson. And then it will have achieved, real political power. And more than power, it will have turned it into law. And that is, how things are really changed. Right now, we're seeing the limits of what can be done because people are outside of power. And the idea is to really make a more fundamental change.
Thanks for that question, Rochelle. Well, let's see if we can get a couple more in, Maddie.
Sure. Jessica, how about you go next?
Hi, my name is Jessica Wang, and I'm a rising sophomore at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I'm curious as to how you would say right-wing American beliefs differ generally across generations. What are the, if any, main points of disagreement between older and younger people who identify with the right, compared to as how younger people on the left now often err further left than their parents?
Every poll I've seen about this shows that your generation is considerably more tolerant, considerably, if you want to say, on the left, regardless of political party. I mean, there are many younger Republicans, for example, who may believe heartily in lower taxes and all the rest of it, but they object firmly to the homophobia that's so rampant in the mainstream of the Republican Party. I think on race as well. I think that the younger generation is much less overall than their parents. So I think this is it's actually a credit, I think, to your parents, and then maybe that's me too. But that something has shifted in American political life at that level, so that even Republicans are facing a generation gap, a generational problem. But it's going to be much more severe for them because the difference between their leadership and those young Republicans is much greater than the divisions inside the Democratic Party, I think. Sid?
Yeah. Generational experiences when you're your age are formative and carry for a lifetime, and they brand a whole generation, and that's carried forward for decades. It doesn't mean that a generation is all one thing. Sean and I are part of a generation, and our formative years were the 60s and the early 70s. And they changed us. All of our generation did not do what we did, we're not engaged in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and all the other social movements that grew out of that. But that's what created the basis over time upon which the current movements are operating. And you can see it in the life of John Lewis and the inspiration that he gives to people. I think that's a very useful person to look at in those terms and look at his whole life cycle of where he starts. Look at the 22-year-old John Lewis, and then look at the John Lewis who served with Jamie.
In fact, I think that John was 17 or 18 years old when he was in SNCC. I mean, he was really the age of the young people who've assembled here today.
He was actually 20, but that's okay.
He was 20 in SNCC. Okay, well, he said I guess he had started to do some stuff in his teens.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And we got some 20-year-olds out there too. So we Democracy Summer, of course, is inspired by Freedom Summer, and John did speak to some of our kids a few years ago, along with some other colleagues. All right, Maddie, let's do one final question, and we'll let our guests conclude for us.
All right, our final question is from Neve.
Hello, my name is Neve Leibowitz. I'm a rising senior from Silver Spring, Maryland. My question is, in the near future, do you see an emergence of a major third party made up of moderates from both sides?
My answer is depends on what happens in November, but no. I don't see a major third party coming up. I think that what we're seeing now, the polarization that we're seeing now, will lead either to a Republican Party somehow grabbing it out of the out of nowhere, out of the fire in the current situation and reelecting Donald Trump, which I don't think is going to happen. Or we're going to see the Democratic Party come back into power, but I don't see a third party springing up as a moderate party in between the two of those. But Sid's a much more much closer to this than I am. So what do you think?
Yes, Sid, you wrote a lot about Lincoln creating the Republican Party as a new party. But I mean, what about it? Do you think that Bloomberg or Ross Perot, I guess, tried to recently?
Yeah, I think that the failure of Bloomberg this year reveals a lot about the fallacy of particularly some multi-billionaire coming in and reshaping the Democratic Party in his image. The Democratic Party over time is becoming a much broader and diverse and yet at the same time more coherent party than it's ever been. It has a very wide range, but it is unwilling to engage in internecine warfare of the kind that will rip it apart, at least this year, and is much more interested in facing Donald Trump and the threat that he faces, and more interested in winning an election and doing away with Trump and Trumpism, which is a project that's going to take years to do, and the conflict will continue. The fact that you have this kind of polarization really mitigates against some sort of, I wouldn't call it centrist, or even moderate, some sort of third alternative, a third force that can exist in the in the middle of the battlefield. I just don't see it happening. Both parties in their own way have become more coherent, and the Republican Party, and we'll see in the fall, is becoming a much smaller minority party than the Democratic Party, which is and should be the natural party of governing in America.
Sean, do you have some closing thoughts about right, left, and center and how young people should orient towards the whole political system?
Wow, that's a big one. I think they're just playing off what Sid just said, though. I think that we're at a remarkable turning point in American history for all the reasons we've been talking about for the last 10, 15 minutes or so. What we're seeing, as we say, we're living in history. What we're seeing is an extraordinary change. I think that there are many roles to play for young people to play in the political system. You can want to run for office. You might want to become involved in the judiciary. There's a lot of ways you can be involved, or you can stand outside of politics and be an agitator of one kind or another. But I think that the possibilities after 50 years, going back beyond 50 years, going back to Goldwater in '64, going back to Reagan certainly in 1980, there has been this conservative hegemony in American politics, interrupted at various moments with the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, but essentially that's been it. And we're seeing the collapse of that hegemony, I believe, at the moment. And that opens up possibilities for you that our generation never really saw. Those of us who came of age in 1968, it was a terrible year, and that was the beginning of the end. And then we've had to live with this our entire lives, one way or another, always fighting the battles on the defensive. I think that that's about to change, and I just wish I were 40 years younger.
Well, they'll be young for you guys. Sid, do you have any closing thoughts?
Well, to be forever young. Just on this right-wing business, and Trump has transformed the Republican Party, and it cannot go back to being some other mythical version of the Republican Party. It is this party. It has to go forward in reality from what Trump has done to it, and he has. When they talk about the base of the Trump base, that's the heart of the Republican Party. It's the vast majority of it, and that's why Republicans in this coming election, particularly for the Senate and also for some House, are between a rock and a hard place, because they're between the Republican base and the majority. People say
you got to feed the base.
Yeah, but if they
kill yourself in the process,
they get punished.
Yeah, they kill yourself.
So this is a party in a historic, unenviable position, but it's going to go on and not be something else. And who are engaged in the popular front now against Trump will not be able to, recover or revive a Republican Party that has died. And in a way, they helped bring this moment about, this terrible Trump moment, and now they're, helping to fight it. But the Republican Party as it existed before Trump no longer exists, nor can it be resurrected. And the Democrats need to understand and that what they're recognize these are not two parties that are just hold different principles, but somehow are the same, and in a system where there's the alternation of power. No, this is a real struggle for fundamental beliefs and for the future of the country.
Another way of putting this is that the Republicans are between a rock and a hard base.
Right.
And they'll never recover from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, I will end on a note of hope based on Professor Wilentz's statement that he sees the collapse of the hegemony of the right. And that gives me something to look forward to, because, of course, every day I am seeing extreme right-wing Republicans acting out, angry, profane, as they were yesterday with my beloved colleague, AOC, and determined to win at all costs. And so if there is a collapse of right-wing ideological hegemony, we still have to fight them on the ground at the ballot box every step along the way, and we got to defend our election. And that's what the Democracy Summer Fellows are all about. You've given them a lot to think about and a lot of great inspiration. Sidney Blumenthal, Professor Sean Wilentz, thank you very much today. Everybody give them a standing or sitting ovation from wherever you are right now.
Thank you.
And come back and see us anytime.
Thank you, Jamie.
And thanks for joining us, everybody.
Take care.